Welcome to this explainer. When you're just standing on the beach looking out at the ocean, it really just looks like this vast, uniform expanse of water stretching out into the horizon, right? But underneath that surface simplicity is actually a highly complex map of invisible legal borders. And these unseen lines, they literally govern everything from international security to trillion-dollar resource industries.
Okay, let's dive into this. Where does a country's border actually end? I mean, it sounds like a simple question. You'd probably think it just stops right where the sand meets the water. But in international maritime law, the shoreline is literally just the beginning. We're going to take a bit of a spatial journey today, moving step by step from the coast all the way out into the deep sea to figure out exactly how nations carve up the ocean.
So here is our navigational chart for the explainer. We're moving layer by layer through this legal architecture. We'll hit drawing the baseline, the territorial sea, the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, the continental shelf, and wrap up with resolving overlapping claims. Getting a grip on these specific zones and the exact terminology used to regulate them is absolutely crucial to decoding how maritime law actually works out in the real world.
All right, Section 1, drawing the baseline, the starting point for all zones.
So our first stop isn't even in the deep water at all. We're starting right on the shoreline because this establishes the legal anchor for everything that happens out at sea. Under the legal framework, every single maritime zone calculation has to start from what's called the baseline. Basically, if you don't know where your baseline is, you can't measure any of your ocean territory. It's the fundamental starting line from which the breadth of the territorial sea, contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone, and continental shelf are all measured. Now, actually drawing this line isn't always super straightforward. A normal baseline just follows the low water line along the coast at the absolute lowest tide. But think about this. What if your coast looks like the deeply indented fjords of Scandinavia? Or what if it has a crazy complex network of fringing islands? Tracing every single little inlet would be practically impossible. So, for those situations, international law allows for straight baselines. These are artificial straight lines that just join points across the water. But there are really strict rules for this. They can't depart appreciably from the general direction of the coast. There's also this thing called the semicircle rule for bays, which makes sure that only true, deeply enclosed bodies of water can be closed off with a straight line. Moving on to Section 2, the territorial sea, absolute sovereignty. Okay, so once we have securely drawn our baseline, we can finally step off the beach and get into the water, entering our very first official maritime zone. Sitting immediately adjacent to the coast, right up against the landmass and starting at the baseline, is the territorial sea. Under maritime law, a state has the right to establish the breadth of its territorial sea up to a limit of 12 nautical miles from that baseline. And that 12 nautical miles is the standard maximum width accepted globally. Now here's where the terminology gets really important. The key word for this zone is sovereignty. In the territorial sea, the coastal state has absolute control. This sovereignty extends way beyond just the water itself. It goes all the way up into the airspace above and all the way down into the seabed and subsoil below. Legally speaking, this 12 nautical mile band is treated almost exactly like the country's actual landmass. Though there is one major exception, foreign ships do generally enjoy the right of innocent passage through these waters as long as they keep moving continuously and don't threaten the coastal state. Section 3. The contiguous zone, functional enforcement. Pushing a little further out from the shore now, we transition from that area of absolute sovereignty into a specialized buffer area. Stepping progressively outward, the contiguous zone sits immediately seaward of the territorial sea. And it's here that the legal jurisdiction of the coastal state begins to shift and actually becomes a lot more limited. So, the contiguous zone can stretch up to 24 nautical miles from those original baselines. But remember, the territorial sea already takes up the first 12 miles, right? So the contiguous zone effectively just gives a state an additional 12-mile band of specific jurisdiction right on the border of its sovereign territory. So why does this extra zone even exist? Well, it acts as a functional enforcement buffer. In this specific zone, the coastal state doesn't have full sovereignty anymore, but it does have the power to exercise enforcement jurisdiction over 4 very specific areas: customs, fiscal or tax matters, immigration, and sanitary laws. This is a brilliant setup because it strengthens law enforcement capacity. It essentially stops smugglers, illegal immigrants, or criminals from just hovering an inch outside the 12-mile territorial sea line and claiming they can't be touched. That brings us to Section 4.
the exclusive economic zone resource wealth.
All right, now we're pushing our voyage way further out into the open ocean, entering the maritime zone that honestly carries the most massive economic implications for our modern world. Think about the massive leap in scale here. The exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, dwarfs the territorial sea and the contiguous zone combined. We are talking about a vastly larger spatial ambit of jurisdiction.
200 nautical miles. That is the magic number to remember here. The exclusive economic zone can extend up to 200 nautical miles from the baseline. That represents a truly staggering amount of ocean area placed directly under the economic jurisdiction of the coastal state.
But, and this is absolutely crucial for understanding maritime regulation terminologies, the coastal state does not have full sovereignty here, like it does close to shore. Instead, the law grants them what's called sovereign rights. And these rights are strictly limited to the exploration, exploitation, conservation, and management of natural resources. So what does that mean? It means the coastal state owns the rights to the fish in the water, the oil beneath the seabed, and the wind above the surface. But other states still enjoy huge freedoms here, like international navigation and flying right over it. Section 5. The continental shelf, the seabed underneath.
Now, let's shift our perspective downward for a second. We're going to look right past the water column of the EEZ and focus purely on the deep ocean floor. The continental shelf comprises the seabed and the subsoil of those submarine areas. Interestingly, the physical continental margin can actually extend even further out than that 200 nautical mile EEZ limit, slowly sloping down towards the really deep ocean floor.
And there's this really fascinating tension right here between science and law. Scientifically speaking, a continental shelf is a geological feature. It's literally the submerged prolongation of the landmass. But the legal concept, it's completely different. Under maritime law, a coastal state is automatically entitled to rights over the seabed up to 200 nautical miles, even if there is absolutely no physical geological shelf that extends that far. It's an amazing example of how legal definitions are intentionally crafted to ensure equitable economic rights regardless of the underlying geology. Section 6. Resolving overlapping claims, islands, rocks, and lines. So we have these massive 200 nautical mile zones, right? But what happens when countries are located opposite or adjacent to each other and these huge invisible borders crash into one another? Well, this brings us to the climax of our legal journey. When lines overlap, every single point of measurement becomes a high-stakes battleground. And honestly, nothing is more fiercely debated than the difference between an island and a rock. In maritime law, an island, which means it's naturally formed and can sustain human habitation or economic life, generates a full 200-mile EEZ and continental shelf. We're talking potentially tens of thousands of square miles of resource rights. A rock, on the other hand, which cannot sustain human or economic life, generates absolutely zero EEZ. It only gets a 12-mile territorial sea. So proving a tiny feature in the ocean is an island rather than a mere rock, that can literally secure or lose unimaginable wealth. This specific legal distinction is exactly why maritime delimitation disputes are so incredibly intense today. So, to quickly summarize our voyage, we've basically revealed this brilliant, graduated system of control. Closest to shore, in the territorial sea, a state exercises absolute sovereignty. You move out to the contiguous zone, and that control drops to specific enforcement jurisdiction. Further out in the EEZ and continental shelf, it diminishes again to just sovereign rights over resources. And finally, once you cross that outer boundary, you enter the high seas, where the waters are governed by the rights of the international community as a whole. Well, we've traveled from the low-water baseline all the way out into the international abyss today, decoding both the specific terminology and the profound meaning behind these legal boundaries. So next time you look out at the open ocean, are you going to see just a uniform expanse of water? Or will you see the invisible borders shaping the wealth, jurisdiction, and security of our entire world? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning what lies beneath the surface.